I feel like this cup means I should try an Irish accent, but I don't think I can. Hey guys, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about something I know much more about than the Irish accent, literature. I've gotten a lot of messages from you guys that actually let me know that I have a lot of English majors watching me, and I know that generally most of you guys also really like to read. So what I'm going to talk about today is just some of the approaches to reading that I've taken in the past. I've written a lot of papers in my days. So first thing I'm going to start with the biggest project that I've done, and that's my dissertation for my master's degree. For this I chose to write about the British author Elizabeth Gaskell, and I studied North and South, Wives and Daughters, Mary Barton, and Cousin Phyllis by her. And the main subject that I focused on was activity and passivity with her characters. So I split this into 3 chapters. The first chapter I talked about silence and speaking and how that sort of related to the active and passive moments that I saw from mostly her main characters. The second chapter I talked about obedience and transgression, so typically activity tended to correlate with transgression, and passivity tended to correlate with obedience. In the third chapter I talked about family and romance, and how the characters' roles in each of these situations in their familial, that's a kind of weird word, familial bonds and their romantic bonds, what sort of activity and passivity was called for, and how they acted in each situation, etc., etc. And yeah, it's the biggest project that I've done. It was about like 60 pages, I think, 15,000 words, so that was a summer. And of course, I have an English major. I've written about Shakespeare. I've actually written a few papers about Shakespeare, but one in particular, I think probably my favorite, one of my favorite papers that I've written, was about Othello. Othello is possibly one of the most melodramatic Shakespeares in my opinion, and that's really saying something because it's Shakespeare. And it's all about lies and deceit and mistrusting everyone and all of this melodramatic stuff, and what I talked about was the fraternal and the sororal bonds. I think for Othello, it's easy to automatically focus on the romantic, twisted relationship between Othello and Desdemona and how that works out. Spoilers. But what's interesting is with this twisted romantic relationship going on, and Iago and Emilia, their romance, their marriage is completely ridiculous. It's so wrong in so many ways. Despite all of this twistedness with those relationships, supposedly the strongest relationships in Shakespeare, you know, Romeo and Juliet and all of that, love conquers all type of stuff, you have these bonds between the 2 men, Iago and Othello, and the bonds between the women, Desdemona and Emilia, and those actually last throughout the play. So with all this deceit, Iago is able to convince Othello about some sort of wrongness that his wife has done. I don't want to give too many spoilers in case you haven't read it, read it, but he's able to convince him and cause him to do this horrific thing at the end of the play and completely go insane. And that's because of the strength and the trust that Othello has in that fraternal bond. And with the sororal bonds, they're not quite as dramatic because the women don't do anything quite as crazy as the men, but the sort of trust that they have in each other is much stronger. It's a much stronger bond than what they have with their husbands. Another thing I really liked to do in my undergrad was sort of surprise my traditional English professors and write about some new literature. I really liked to take some of these older concepts, the theory and the things that we're talking about and applying to classics, and apply them also to what a lot of people are reading today. I took a literary theory class a few years ago, and we had to write 3 papers. The first 2 I was very serious and wrote about very serious texts and things, and then for the third one I decided to do a feminist theory critique of Twilight. Yes, I did it. I submitted a paper about Twilight to my college professor. In this, I took ideas from Gilbert and Gubar's theories and their idea of the angel and the demon woman. I think it's actually quite applicable to Twilight, but one particular thing that I want to mention, because I think it's kind of an interesting thing I zoomed in on, but it came to dialogue tags. Edward's dialogue tags were very reflective of his character, and same with Bella's. So Edward's tended to be things like commanded or pushed, corrected, ordered, things like that, and Bella's, on the other hand, tended to be muttered, mumbled, babbled, confessed. This is so representative of their characters. It's ridiculous how representative this is just through the tags that she put. And I could get into a dialogue tag discussion about how I hate the overusage of these fancy dialogue tags rather than just said or cutting them or whatever. But the point is, it's crazy how blatantly obvious these things were pointing out the flaws of her own characters. It just blows my mind. Don't even get me started about 50 Shades of Grey. We're not even gonna talk about it. Taking a chill pill now. I'm okay. It's okay. And I also wrote a paper about the Hunger Games. When I was doing my big final work for my undergraduate degree and I had to do a presentation in front of the department and everything, I chose to do it on the Hunger Games. I'm a rebel. The class that I took was focused on taboo in literature, so things that we're not supposed to talk about. You know, we studied a lot of banned literature or literature that had twisted societies within the literary world, and that made me think of the Hunger Games. So I studied just the first Hunger Games book, and I talked about the taboo of knowledge. The argument for my paper was that above everything else that the Capitol fears, that the Capitol is trying to bring down and enforce against, is knowledge. Ultimately, it really just boils down to trying to keep their secrets and trying to keep the districts in the dark. I actually think it came together pretty well. Everyone seemed to approve of it. I got a really good grade. Take chances, kids. Take chances. And the last paper I'm going to talk about is one that I did about Little Women. This book has had so much criticism written about it. It's insane how much you can find about it. And actually a lot of it tends to dwell on feminist literary critiques, obviously, because it has so many female characters, it's written by a female author. It's perfect for that, really. But what I wanted to do was look at some of the arguments that feminists were using within this text, and I wanted to look at them a little broader as applied to all the characters. So I talked about societal pressures as a whole, and I talked about how those basically decided the future of the youth. I used examples of a couple of the young women in the text. I used Laurie as an example, a young man, and I talked about how, even overarching gender, there were certain societal expectations about how young people had to behave and what young people had to become in their futures. And of course, society is being played by parents, authorities, family members, and just the general environment they were in. It was extremely taboo for someone to do something out of the ordinary, and if you did, you instantly felt the pressure by people. You couldn't go to a party and act the way you weren't supposed to act. If you wanted not to be shunned by your community, you had to follow these rules. So what do you guys think about all this? Which one of those papers sounded the most interesting to you, perhaps? Thank you guys all so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.